I'm Violet. The room was deathly silent, and all eyes were on my grandfather. His face had turned as pale as a sheet, and his hands trembled violently as he held the contents of the envelope I'd given him. Just moments ago, he'd laughed at me, along with my aunt, as I opened an empty birthday gift. The cruel words they'd spoken still echoed in my ears, but now, the tables had turned. I cast my mind back to my childhood. I grew up in a large, imposing mansion owned by my grandfather, Mr. Henry Blackwood. He was a wealthy and influential businessman, but his wealth came with a cold and heartless nature. My mother, Lily, was his daughter, but she was never in his good books. In his eyes, my aunt, Rose, was the perfect child. She was spoiled rotten, getting whatever she wanted, while my mother and I lived like servants in our own home. My mother had once been full of life, with a heart as big as the ocean. But years of my grandfather's abuse had worn her down. She worked tirelessly around the house, cooking, cleaning, and running errands, all while being constantly belittled. I remember watching her with a heavy heart as she tried to keep a smile on her face, even when she was clearly in pain. I was just a little girl when my father died in a tragic accident. That was when things got even worse for us. We had nowhere else to go, so we had to move back into my grandfather's house. From that day on, we were treated like outsiders. My aunt and her children lived in luxury, with their own rooms, expensive toys, and designer clothes. My mother and I, on the other hand, slept in a small, cold attic with a leaky roof. Every morning, I'd wake up before dawn, shivering in my thin blanket. My mother and I would tiptoe downstairs so as not to wake the others. She'd start preparing breakfast for everyone, making sure to cook my aunt's favorite dishes. I'd get whatever was left over, sometimes just a few crumbs. My grandfather would walk right past me without even acknowledging my presence, while he doted on my aunt's children. At school, I was a quiet and studious child. I loved learning, and I excelled in my studies. But whenever I brought home an award or a good grade, my grandfather would scoff at me. "That school must be a joke if you're their best," he'd say. My aunt would join in, making cruel comments about my clothes and my appearance. "She looks like a little orphan," she'd whisper, loud enough for everyone to hear. But I didn't let their words break me. Instead, I used them as fuel. I knew that there was something wrong with the way my family treated us, and I was determined to find out what it was. Every night, after I'd finished my chores and eaten my meager dinner, I'd go up to our attic room and pull out my small, leather-bound diary. I'd write down all my thoughts and feelings, and I'd start to plan. One day, I came home from school with a glimmer of hope in my eyes. My teacher, Miss Thompson, had told me that I was very smart and that I had a bright future ahead of me. I'd always thought she was just being kind, but this time, I felt like she really meant it. I gathered the courage to tell her about the way my family treated us and how I suspected my grandfather of hiding something. To my surprise, Miss Thompson didn't brush me off. Instead, she listened intently and then introduced me to a legal NGO that helped children in difficult situations. I was nervous at first, but I knew that this was my chance to find the truth. With the help of the NGO, I started to do some research. I read books about property laws and learned about legal loopholes. I also started to look through old family files in the attic when everyone was asleep. It was a long and difficult process, but I didn't give up. One day, I found something that changed everything. I discovered a land registry form hidden in an old wooden box. The land was supposed to be my grandfather's pride and joy, but I noticed that the name on the form was not his. It was a fake name, and the initials were the same as mine. That's when I realized that my grandfather had registered the land under a false identity to avoid paying taxes. I spent the next few months gathering evidence. I copied papers, took pictures, and even went to government offices to get official documents. I did it all quietly and carefully, making sure that no one suspected a thing. Finally, I had everything I needed. I put it all in a small white envelope and waited for the right moment. That moment came on my 12th birthday. My aunt had announced that she was throwing a family gathering for me, and I was cautiously hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally going to treat me differently. My mother had saved every penny she could to buy me a small music box. She wrapped it in colorful paper with a purple ribbon, my favorite color, and tucked a note inside that said, "To my brightest light, keep shining." But as soon as I opened the box and found it empty, I knew that it was all a cruel joke. My grandfather laughed, and my aunt joined in, calling me and my mother worthless. I felt a fire inside me, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over to my grandfather. I handed him the envelope and said, "It's okay, Grandpa. I got you a gift, too." He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and amusement. "What is this? A drawing?" he mocked. But as he opened the envelope and started to read the contents, his face changed. The first paper was a legal document, stamped and signed. It clearly showed that the land was registered in my name. The second paper was an old photograph of my grandfather shaking hands with a government official, with the land registry form in the background. And the third paper was a letter I'd written, explaining everything. My grandfather's knees buckled, and he had to hold on to the table to steady himself. "She's bluffing," he barked, but his voice was unsteady. My aunt dropped her glass, and it shattered on the floor. Everyone in the room was in shock. Just then, a lawyer, an old friend of the family, stepped forward and examined the documents. "It's legit," he said quietly. "This land is legally under her name." My grandfather looked like he was about to faint. I looked at him and said softly, "You always said I don't deserve anything. I just wanted to prove you wrong." Those words seemed to hit him like a ton of bricks. Before he could recover, I stepped forward and said, "Grandpa, I'm not here to kick you out. You can continue living there, but only if you start treating people better." My words hung in the air, and I could see the realization dawn on his face. My aunt tried to argue, saying that it was all nonsense and that the land belonged to the family. But I was ready. I reached into my backpack and pulled out another set of documents. "You can check these, too, or ask your lawyer," I said calmly. My grandfather tried his last resort. He pulled out his phone and called his lawyer, putting the call on speaker. "Tell them this isn't legal," he demanded. But after a moment, the lawyer's voice echoed through the room. "I've reviewed everything. The documents are valid. The land is no longer yours. I warned you years ago about this." The room fell silent again. I didn't gloat or laugh. I simply took my mother's hand and stood beside her. The power shift was calm, dignified, and undeniable. We moved out of that toxic house, leaving behind the shadows of the past. With the wealth from the land I now owned, we found a small but cozy house of our own. For the first time in years, my mother and I could breathe freely. I returned to school with a newfound confidence. My grades continued to soar, and I became more involved in school activities. I no longer walked with my head down. I held my head high, knowing that I had overcome so much. My grandfather's house remained the same, but he had changed. He was a broken man, haunted by his own actions. He never again mocked me or my mother. My aunt started visiting us, but her smiles were forced, and her words were empty. She had no more power over us. The final victory came when I stood on stage at my school's award ceremony. As my name was announced, I looked out at the audience and saw my mother beaming with pride. I took a deep breath and started my speech. "They tried to break me, but my mom taught me how to build," I said, my voice clear and strong. And just like that, the past was truly gone. We had won, not just for us, but for everyone who believed in us.